Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. I'm your host, Joe, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So, we're taping this episode on Friday, November 6th, with still no presidential call, but with Mr. Biden looking inevitable. It's been quite a week, Mark.
It's been a hell of a week. You could pretty much chart the progress of the week by the amount of sleep that I got at night.
Yeah.
Like Tuesday, I was tossing and turning. Wednesday, I was feeling pretty good. Last night, I slept pretty close to normal. And tonight, I'm hoping to sleep like a baby.
Yeah, you and me both. Before we leave that subject, I just want to mention for the record that, Mark, you nailed it on your prediction a couple of podcasts ago that Kanye West would not be elected president of the United States. So I want to give you room to take a bow on that one.
Yeah, I went out on a limb that we would not be saluting President Kanye this time out. I think I read that he got a total of about 50,000 votes spread out over the 12 states that he was eligible in. So
Yes.
He bagged about 4,000 to 5,000 votes per state.
Yeah, I mean, I read 60,000, but he didn't get more than 0.4% of the share in any one state.
Yeah.
So, but he is running again in 2024, so
Yes.
we can reprise this podcast in 4 short years.
Yeah, listeners, swing back around again 4 years from now so we can take a second swing at that. Though I will once again point out, like I did in that episode, that Kanye believes that God appoints the president. So he, I, and you, Joe, we will all be waiting to see who God appoints in 2024.
Indeed. Okay, on to this week's topic. And as I mentioned at the end of our last session, I really wanted to change a pace on this one. I wanted us to discuss something interesting, but upon which the fate of the Republic didn't hang. So I chose movie theaters. And, the demise of movie theaters has been predicted for so many years. I myself, in arguments with friends, have predicted the demise of movie theaters. And I think with the advent of the coronavirus pandemic this year, the prospect of movie theaters shutting for good actually became, in my opinion at least, more realistic. So I want to put the question to you, Mark. Will movie theaters even exist a generation from now? What do you think?
I think it's an excellent question. It turned out to be really fascinating when I started to dig into it. And just a side note, I did assume that you were asking about American movie theaters. So that's where I put my research. If you were asking about the future of movie theaters in France, New Zealand, or South Africa, that's going to have to wait for a future episode.
Okay, fair enough.
So let's start with a quick history lesson. Movie theaters as we know them today have a history that stretches back over 100 years. The very first theaters, which opened in the 1890s, were basically sideshows, often just tents that showed short exhibitions of motion pictures, with tickets costing about the modern equivalent of $1. Some theaters interspersed the films with singers or juggling acts. In 1905, the first Nickelodeon was established in Pittsburgh. Tickets cost 5 cents, which is where the name came from. And that's about $1.50 in today's money, so it was a bargain. About 3,000 Nickelodeon theaters opened in the space of 2 years, and by 1914, 1 in 4 Americans were going to the movies every week. So as the industry grew up, Hollywood studios became vertically integrated, which means to say they employed the stars, they made the movies, and they also owned the theaters that showed many of the movies. This was the structure that made possible the so-called golden age of Hollywood, but it also forced a lot of not very good movies down viewers' throats. If a studio had a movie they knew wasn't very good, they could still force theaters to show it or force customers to pay for it as the first half of a double feature that included a better movie on the back half. And they were also able to drive rival theaters out of business by keeping all the popular films for themselves. And in the absence of competition, the studios could unilaterally determine the price of a ticket. So in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in U.S. versus Paramount Pictures that this was an illegal trust, and studios were forced to sell their theaters or spin them off as separate companies.
I was just thinking it sounded like a monopoly. So
Yeah, that's actually a landmark trust ruling. Apparently, legal students routinely study that ruling because it defined a lot of antitrust law in the United States. And since then, movie theaters have operated in a close partnership with Hollywood studios, though as we'll see later, the nature of that partnership has changed over time. Also, just a note, in its glorious pro-business anti-regulation wisdom, the Trump administration actually got the court to rescind that ruling, the U.S. against Paramount. On August 7th, 2020, a 2-year sunset period began, after which studios will be free to start buying up theaters again. So this could be a sea change within the industry in about a 2-year time.
Interesting. I'll bet you Disney will be right out of the gate buying movie theaters after that.
I imagine they cannot wait. So how do theaters make their money today? The first thing is it's not really through selling tickets. In the first few weeks of a movie's release, a big chunk of what you pay for a ticket goes right back to the studio. The terms vary from movie to movie, but if you see a movie in its first week or two of release, the theater may only keep 1/4 or 1/5 of the price of the ticket, and they pay the rest back to the studio. During this initial period, the theater actually loses money on the tickets, but they expect to make that back on concessions, and we'll take a closer look at concessions later. When Star Wars Attack of the Clones came out in 2002, the theaters lost a lot of money during that first week because the studio had negotiated a 100% cut of ticket revenue for that first week. And then it turned out that the movie was pretty crappy, so really nobody was happy with that arrangement. In the third or fourth week after a movie's release, the percentage shifts to something like a 50-50 cut, and then the theater keeps more still towards the end of the movie's run. But by then, of course, there are far fewer people in the seats, so the theaters are keeping a bigger piece of a much smaller pie.
Wow, Mark, I had no idea that was the business model. I'm really shocked to hear that. It sounds a lot like Broadway theater's business model, where the investors get paid back, and after a certain amount of weeks or months, the show is considered a success if everybody got their money back.
Yeah, I know. It's a tremendous gamble for the theaters in terms of selecting which movies they're going to feature, because there's a huge benefit to them, both in terms of the number of people it brings in initially, but also the long tail for that, because they have so much money to be made on a movie that will keep packing people in the seats after they're sending most of the money back to the studio. Adding it all up, the sources differ on the final balance, but depending on who you ask, the theaters keep an average of as little as 40% or as much as 53% of total ticket revenue. To take one example, in 2018, the theater conglomerate Cinemark reported that they sold $1.8 billion worth of movie tickets, and $1 billion of that went back to the studios. The money a movie theater makes from tickets more or less covers their cost of operations. And actually, the price of a movie ticket has been pretty flat for quite a while. USA Today charted average ticket prices from 1946 to 2019, and the cheapest ticket in that span was back in 1952, when you could see High Noon and Singing in the Rain for an average ticket cost of 48 cents.
Wow.
Adjusting for inflation, that comes out to $4.71 today. So that's quite a bargain for high quality movies.
Yeah.
The most expensive ticket wasn't in the most recent year, though. You'd have spent the most on a movie in 1971, when Diamonds Are Forever and A Clockwork Orange set you back an average of $1.65, which is equal to a whopping $10.60 today.
Okay, but that's a good double feature.
That's an excellent double feature. While movie tickets in reality may be no more expensive than in previous years, you still hear a lot about how movie tickets have grown too expensive. A study in 2018 said high ticket prices were the primary reason why people are not seeing more movies. And 40% of seniors recently reported that they no longer go to the movies at all because they find it too expensive. And my guess is that it's not the price of a movie ticket that's causing the problem, it's the perceived value of that ticket. Nowadays, what you pay for a single movie ticket can get you an entire month of a streaming service, and there are a bunch of them to choose from. You got Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, Peacock, and Apple TV Plus. So people are comparing those monthly subscription fees, which are usually around $10 to $15 and sometimes less, to the price of a single movie out, and the total price can approach $100 for a family of 4 that stops at the concession stand for popcorn and drinks. And that's a lot of money to drop on a single night's entertainment. At least it seems like a lot when the options at home are so much cheaper. But let's go back to movie theater economics. After the theaters break even on tickets, they make their money through concessions and especially popcorn. The electric popcorn maker was invented in 1925 by Charles Manley, and he marketed his invention to movie theaters and has been a match made in snack heaven ever since. Theaters originally didn't allow snacks inside. They were afraid that we'd all make a mess and ruin their carpet, but eventually they gave in and made it a part of the experience. And around the same time that movie popcorn became an institution, we also saw the advent of classic movie snacks like Goobers in 1925, Milk Duds in 1926, and Raisinets in 1927.
Milk Duds is my go-to snack at the movie theater.
They're very good. I am very fond also of Raisinets, and I had no idea that so much of candy history was packed into just the span of 2 years between 1925 and 1927. Those were years of radical, profound innovation in the candy industry. This has been really good for cinemas. The profit margin on a box of popcorn is a healthy 85%. And popcorn, unlike tickets, has rapidly increased in price. In 1929, you'd spend about 5 cents or 76 cents adjusted for inflation on a bag of popcorn. But a medium-sized tub of popcorn today will set you back $8. There's an old industry saying, find a good place to sell popcorn and build a movie theater there.
It does seem, if we could just pause on popcorn for a minute, it just seems to me like the sizes for popcorn starts with obscene and gets larger from there, you know?
Yeah.
So I can't see how some people can eat the gigantic tubs of popcorn that they sell at the theaters these days.
Well, I mean, speaking as someone who has tried, part of it is they have that ingenious little upsell thing where the smaller one is quite a bit smaller, but just a tiny little bit cheaper.
Yes.
So they have that pitch of just for another 20 cents, you can get this obscene thing, which of course leaves you completely covered in butter by the time you're done eating it
Right.
and sick and questioning your life choices. But
Right.
it works out great for the theater because since there's such a ridiculous markup on popcorn, the bigger the tub of popcorn, the greater their profit percentage. And so it's all winning for them.
It's like, what the hell? Congestive heart failure? It's just 20 cents more. Bring it on.
The CEO of Regal Cinemas told the Los Angeles Times, quote, "If we didn't charge as much for concessions as we did, the tickets to the movies would cost $20, unquote. And that quote is dated to 2008, when the average ticket price was $7.18. So he was making a pretty serious threat. So on the whole, it's not easy to make money as the owner of a movie theater. Prior to the pandemic, AMC, which is the largest theater chain in the world, was operating just about at the break-even point. They made a little money in good years and lost a little money in the lean years. But then the pandemic hit and now everyone is losing money, which has led to an explosion of articles in the last year wondering how movie theaters can possibly survive COVID-19 if they were barely profitable in the first place. But at least you'd think that if the majority of movie ticket money goes back to the studios, Hollywood must really be motivated to help the theaters out and protect those future profits. But that's not necessarily true. When you break down a Hollywood studio's revenue sources, movie ticket sales in the domestic market account for about 15 to 16% of a film's gross revenue. Another 24 or 25% comes from foreign ticket sales, and what's left, which is about 60% of average movie revenue, comes from other sources. That's Blu-ray and DVD sales, rights fees paid by cable and streaming channels, merchandise, and so on. The original Star Wars movie was not the first Hollywood summer blockbuster. That would be Jaws, which came out 2 years earlier in 1875. But it was the movie that changed the way Hollywood thinks about its business because it made just so much money from all the products around the movie. You had Star Wars toys, Star Wars comic books, Star Wars novelizations, Star Wars cartoons, Star Wars video games. Kids went to school with Star Wars lunchboxes. There was even Star Wars candy. And I don't know if you saw this at the time, Joe, when it came out, but there was a Jar Jar Binks Monster Mouth tongue candy. Did you see that one?
No, and the reason for that is because I was a complete Star Trek elitist snob at that time and would not even go to see the Star Wars movies because I thought they were threatening the unique dominion of my cherished Star Trek.
Well, stand your ground, Joe. Fight the power. Fight the power. Well, this was when The Phantom Menace came out, which is, I think, by general consensus, possibly the worst Star Wars movie that ever came out. And a big part of it being a bad movie was the Jar Jar Binks character, which everybody hated and was possibly even a racist caricature. And so the Jar Jar Binks Monster Mouth tongue candy was already going to be a little bit controversial. But on top of that, the candy itself was a plastic model of the character Jar Jar Binks' head, and that the candy element was his tongue. So think about that for a little bit and realize that enjoying that candy meant French kissing Jar Jar Binks, and that this was being marketed to children.
I'd frankly rather not think about that any longer, so let's move on.
I cannot blame you. And the Star Wars universe has spawned, by my informal count, and I could be off on this because I did it in my head, 9 sequels and a successful TV show, the second season of which is currently streaming on Disney+. And the Star Wars movie IP is what makes every subsequent Star Wars movie so valuable. And here's an example. In 2015, we got the first of the new Star Wars trilogy, The Force Awakens. The domestic box office was $652 million, which sounds like a solid hit since it brought back more than double the movie's $306 million production budget. But probably $340 to $350 million of the $652 million was kept by the theaters, though. So the studio cut was somewhere in the neighborhood of only $200 million, give or take. And that's not even taking into account associated expenses, such as advertising, which reportedly cost $29 million.
Right.
So if it was just about ticket sales, that movie would have been a financial disaster for Disney. But the retail associated with the movie brought in another $700 million in the year it was released. And unlike ticket sales, all of that money went right back to the studio. And the movie provided Disney with a range of new characters, such as Rey, that they can now feature in Disneyland rides, action figures, video games, and what have you.
You know, you've also just answered the question of why there's so much crap coming out of Hollywood, because instead of focusing on stories and writing, they're focusing on merchandising. So how could you possibly have good films if the key profit motive is about merchandising?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So from the perspective of the movie theaters, a hit movie is one that sells lots of tickets to customers who will then buy a lot of popcorn. For the movie studios, though, that's just part of the picture, and over time it's becoming less and less important. So consider the dilemma of today's American movie theater. They're absolutely dependent on Hollywood studios. They need them to churn out a regular supply of high-quality movies that will get people to put down the television remote, shut off their phones, and go see a movie. The studios, though, are much less financially dependent on people going to the movies. When they decide which movies to produce, they're looking for, first, something that's easy to translate, because they want this movie to play well in China, and Germany, and France, and India. So that gives a bias towards action and away from dialogue and humor that may not translate as well. Second, they're looking for something that could lend itself to merchandising, like you said. So there's a second bias to broad heroes that might appeal to children whose parents will then buy them action figures. And then third, they're looking for something that can be part of a franchise to make the marketing job easier. So think a Fast and Furious movie, or a James Bond movie, or Tom Cruise in yet another Mission Impossible. The audience already knows exactly what to expect from this sort of movie, so you don't need to do a lot of convincing to get them to go out and see it. Movies that don't fit this model aren't really getting made anymore. For instance, if you want to watch a romantic comedy and you're looking for something new, your best bet is Netflix, not Hollywood. There's still an audience for this sort of thing. The rom-coms in Netflix have done pretty well, but it doesn't fit the Hollywood model, and so the new rom-com scripts are simply not often bought or produced. The people watching these movies on Netflix might be willing to go to a theater instead. Dinner and a movie has been a dating staple for decades, and what better movie for date night than a romantic comedy? But instead, they're staying home. And these are the industry trends that have made Disney the prototypical gold standard modern Hollywood studio. They are making movies focused almost exclusively on stories and characters they can then leverage throughout an entire portfolio of products. They have an enormous wealth of intellectual property mined from Disney Animation, Pixar, Marvel Studios, and Star Wars. And then, of course, they have their theme parks. In 2015, for instance, Disney reported twice as much profit, $16 billion, from their amusement parks than from movies and television combined. To an extent, Disney's movies and TV shows serve as marketing for Disneyland and Disney World. So Disney was already in a great position, but as of this year, they are vertically integrated via Disney Plus, their streaming channel, which allows them to stream their movies directly to the consumer and cut out the movie theater middleman. Pixar's next tentpole movie, Soul, which is supposed to come out in theaters, is dropping directly onto Disney Plus on Christmas Day this year. Disney makes a lot of movies, and the movies sell a lot of tickets, but the House of Mouse is in no way dependent on box office receipts to keep the business going. So imagine the plight of the movie theater owner. You are half of a very unequal partnership. It's kind of as if you're married, so you have a ring on your finger and you are fully committed to the relationship, but your partner believes that actually you're just dating, and they might even be thinking about breaking up with you altogether. It is not a good situation.
And, we're talking about some generic movie theater proprietor, but it seems to me, from what you were saying earlier, that we need to further distinguish between the megaplexes of the world, which at least are getting a sniff of profit through the volume business of showing all those Marvel and Disney blockbusters and all the concession revenue. But then there's the small art house, where the independent films are shown, and I can't imagine how they've survived. Forget the pandemic. How did they even survive before the pandemic, since there's really no business model in that at all?
Yeah, I have no doubt that, much like restaurants, a number of them probably will go under. Others might turn to community fundraising to get through to the other side. Yeah. Some of them are going to state, local, or the federal government and looking for arts funding to get them through. And it's a bad situation they're in.
Yeah.
I am not putting a rosy picture on this at all. It's really a struggle for them.
Yeah, that's a sad commentary on the art life of our nation when you need a Kickstarter campaign to keep an important source of art still available to people.
Yeah. The glory days were back when Mozart and Bach were operating, and all you needed was a nobleman to fund your work.
Yeah.
So we need an aristocracy to...
we just voted out that nobleman.
Yeah, that's right. Damn it. We need a new Medici family to come and save our bacon. So for movie theaters to continue operating for another 30 years, they have a lot of obstacles to overcome. And they have so many competitors. Like we said, there are streaming services which are proliferating. You got cable and free TV, which brings you television series, movies, sports, reality TV, and news, and so on. And this is, by the way, the golden age of television, with big-name directors making limited-run series on HBO, Netflix, and elsewhere. Because as with romantic comedies, writers and directors are looking for places where they can tell the sort of story that Hollywood doesn't really seem to want to bankroll anymore. The younger demographic is moving towards things like video games, and those have their own streaming channels, most notably Twitch. And then there's the infamous time suck of social media, much of which we consume by way of our phones. And according to Nielsen, people spend an average of 4 hours per day on their phones.
Yeah. The one thing about a movie theater experience is that communal experience of watching an important or noteworthy film among so many other people. I mean, I have this distinct recollection of watching Jaws in a movie theater when I was 12 years old, summer of 1975, and every scary scene and every feint made by Spielberg in that film set the audience on edge, and there were a lot of gasps and laughter and group reactions. It was just an amazing experience to see Jaws in a movie theater. And for all the benefits, financial and otherwise, of having Netflix and Amazon Prime at your fingertips, that's one thing you're not going to get from streaming a show in your bedroom, Right. And I wonder whether that alone is an argument in favor of continuing existence of movie theaters.
Oh, I think it is. And the way that theaters are trying to survive is by leaning into the things like that are unique to the theater experience. Traditionally, color was a big attractor to the movies. The first color motion picture came out in the 30s, and famously, The Wizard of Oz started out in black and white and then turned into color. That came out in 39. Color TV, meanwhile, wasn't developed until the 40s, and it wasn't a consumer product until the 50s. So that was an edge that pictures had for about 20 years. Great sound systems. I remember when I went to see Earthquake in the theaters when I was a kid. A big pitch to see this in the theater is that the sound system had so much bass to it that you would feel the shaking of the earth. And I remember that impressed me a lot when I was a child.
I think that was called Sensorround. Do you remember that word? Earthquake in Sensorround.
Yes. I think you're right. Yeah, good call on that one. Then there's the big screen lure. In the 80s, when home video was just getting started, theaters invested in bigger screens on the principle that customers would pay for a better experience than they could get at home. And this was an undeniable selling point when TVs were small and pretty crappy, but TV screens have been getting so big and they're super high def, so this advantage has eroded. IMAX is the current gold standard for big screens today, and it can be a powerful experience when it's done right. But some movies just don't work all that well in that format, so it's kind of a niche, I would say. Then there are the gimmicks. And, some people will probably fight me for this, but I think the first movie gimmick that I would call out is 3D, which has a movie history that reaches back to the 50s. And as recently as a few years ago, it was what was supposed to save the movie theater industry. And theater chains spent a bunch of money converting some of their screens for the 3D experience. But it turned out that the movies weren't very good in that format. Hollywood did not make many native 3D productions. They just shot regular movies and converted them to 3D. And I remember I saw Avatar in 3D on an IMAX screen, and I had a good time, but my wife Sonia got just so sick from the movie because the flickering lights made her nauseous, and she had to keep her one eye or both eyes closed for the entire movie. So it's definitely your mileage may vary scenario on the 3D experience.
Right. Gimmicks are not for everybody.
No, and speaking of gimmicks that were not for everybody, my personal favorite gimmick was called Smell-O-Vision. In 1960, a movie came out called The Scent of Mystery. Quote, a mystery novelist, played by Denholm Elliott, discovers a plan to murder an American heiress, played by Elizabeth Taylor in an uncredited role, while on vacation in Spain. He enlists the help of a taxi driver, played by Peter Lorre, to travel across the Spanish countryside in order to thwart the crime. 30 different scents were injected into theater streets, which are triggered by the movie's soundtrack. And according to Wikipedia, quote, some scenes were designed to highlight Smell-O-Vision's capabilities. In one, wine casks fell off a wagon and rolled down a hill, smashing against a wall, at which point a grape scent was released. Other scenes were accompanied by aromas that revealed key points to the audience. For example, the assassin was identified by the smell of a smoking pipe. Scents used in the films included pipe tobacco, coffee, roses, wine, gunpowder, peppermint, shoe polish, gasoline, perfume, flowers, brandy, fresh sea air, peaches, bananas, wine, and wood shavings. And the film posters proclaimed, first they moved, then they talked, now they smell.
Oh, boy. And, the fact that Elizabeth Taylor, who was probably the biggest movie star in the world at that time, didn't even want to be credited on this picture says a lot about the potential saleability of Smell-O-Vision.
Yeah, I imagine if you wanted to troll Elizabeth Taylor back in the day, you would ask her about Scent of Mystery. The movie opened in 3 specially equipped theaters in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. But when the scents were emitted, there was a distracting hissing noise. And it took quite some time for the scents to reach the balcony. So in some parts of the theater, the smells were disconnected from what was happening on the screen. And everyone ended up blaming each other. The producers blamed the Smell-O-Vision system for being poorly designed. The inventor of the system blamed the producers for screwing up the implementation. And the whole idea was so easy to ridicule that no one really tried it again. Gimmicks tend not to work out very well for theaters. They spend a lot of money installing the equipment and then some more money a few years later tearing all back out again.
Yeah.
So the biggest advantage theaters have enjoyed over the at-home experience is exclusivity, otherwise known as the release window. If you want to see this big, exciting movie, you either have to see it in theaters or wait months for it to come out on DVD. In the 1980s, when VHS players were all the rage and there was a plucky little company with a dream called Blockbuster Video, the theatrical window was 90 days. In 97, the year that the first commercial DVD player was offered for sale in the U.S., the theatrical window had bloomed to an average of 5 months and 22 days. In 2011, though, the studio started to push for simultaneous video-on-demand release. This received aggressive pushback from the big theater chains, who threatened not to carry any of their movies if they didn't respect the release window.
Right.
By 2019, though, the release window had been whittled down to 2 months and 21 days. And this year, big theatrical productions like Mulan and Pixar's Soul went straight to streaming. And this is being presented as a necessity. There are virtually no theaters open in the U.S., so streaming is the only way to release a movie broadly. But everyone knows that the studios are looking closely at the financial outcome of these decisions.
Yeah.
If they make good money with features dropped straight onto streaming, you can expect to see a lot more of that going forward.
Yes. And to that very point, necessity is the mother of invention. And in a pandemic, they're getting a chance to try out this new model of straight to streaming. So if these upcoming blockbusters like that movie Soul you mentioned can generate hundreds of millions of dollars through streaming sales, then I wonder whether the studios might rethink the strategy to put their biggest films in movie theaters.
Yeah.
Why? Why bother?
Yeah. Every penny would go to them. They would possibly drive subscription revenue, which would be greater than the ticket sale for an individual movie. Yeah, it's definitely a win-win if they can get receipts into the same neighborhood as a theatrical release. So movie theaters are still chasing after the better-than-at-home experience. Super comfortable seats is something that they are big on these days. AMC provides an interesting example of this. The company is currently struggling with nearly $5 billion in debt. That's B as in boy, $5 billion.
Yeah.
On an earnings call, they said they'd be out of cash by the end of the year or early 2021 and are likely to declare bankruptcy. And I've seen some news sources just take it for granted that this was a pandemic consequence, but actually AMC accrued that debt in 2019 and earlier before anyone had even heard about COVID-19. Some of that was through acquisition of rival chains, but they were also retrofitting their theaters to offer more comfortable seating. So the pitch here is come see a movie. We have really comfortable chairs, which is easy to make fun of, but I will say that there are two theaters in Seattle that I prefer over the others, and both feature big, comfortable reclining chairs. So maybe that's a sales pitch that actually works.
Yes, and I would agree on my end here. The two closest movie theaters to where I live in Upper West Side of Manhattan have both been outfitted with the comfy chairs. And it is indeed a selling point. It's fun to go collapse into those chairs.
I know.
Or recline in them.
Yeah, the reclining is my favorite part, where you can be at like almost in a lying position and just... the only thing in your frame of reference is the screen. That's my favorite movie scenario. Yeah. Just the laziest possible viewing angle for a movie.
Yeah. So I think that's a winning theory, even though they probably have fewer seats in the theaters now, but they can hike the price a little, and maybe they've got some market research that it's going to put more fannies in the seats.
Right. Some chains are promising restaurant quality food and table service. A few sell alcohol. And they're inevitably going to try the same thing with new technologies that come along. And one that I saw discussed was virtual reality. But as was the case with 3D, they're always going to be dependent on the studios. If no one in Hollywood is making studio quality virtual reality movies, there's probably not much money to be made in showing them.
And let me just say this. I don't mean to put you on the spot with a prediction for the future, but I would welcome it if you do have a prediction. But here's my prediction. I think movie theaters will someday be like vinyl LPs. It'll be this niche thing that used to be big, still exists. If you're an audiophile, if you're a cinephile, you can still go to certain places called movie theaters to get the big community experience of a blockbuster film, but they are not going to be ubiquitous the way they are today. That's my prediction for the future.
I'd like to imagine something a little bit different. And my example is the stage play. There's one city in America, New York City, that has a truly vibrant theater scene. If you're a theater actor, you either live in New York or you want to live in New York. I think that's fair to say. People travel from all over the world to see a play on Broadway. Other major cities have a local theater scene that plays out over a much smaller number of stages. Here in Seattle, we have a single theater, the Paramount, that hosts all of the traveling Broadway productions. That's where Sonia and I saw Hamilton, for instance. There are other stages where you might see something more intimate and on a smaller scale. Smaller cities than Seattle might have only one stage, or they might have none. My best guess is that the movie theater is headed in a similar direction. I imagine there will be one city, which is probably going to be Los Angeles, that will be a premier movie destination, with many theaters screening the latest films from a variety of genres. Cinephiles will plan vacations to go to Los Angeles to watch a bunch of movies. Other cities will have a few screens that focus on showing crowd pleasers, big budget epics that are better on a large screen. And these movies will probably be booked for longer runs. Not as long as a Broadway show, which can go for years, but longer than the handful of weeks when a movie is available now. Some of the theaters, as we've noted, are probably going to be studio-owned. For instance, I think we can be confident that the Disney store in Times Square will someday be paired with a theater that exclusively shows Disney films. And this arrangement will not be ubiquitous. Not every town in America is going to have a Disney store, and not every town in America is going to have a Disney theater. Likewise, if Netflix is still around in 30 years, I could see them owning theaters in major urban centers. And let's say maybe Amazon would own a chain of mid-sized theaters that double as package pickup locations. Small independent theaters in this scenario would play the same role as off-Broadway stages, presenting less commercial work. Indie movies, foreign films, cinema retrospectives. Meanwhile, a lot of movies, the majority, will go exclusively into streaming, and most or all will be available online on the same day that they open in theaters. Independent theaters that survive, I expect to be nimble in presenting a variety of things on their screens when high-draw movies are unavailable. Sporting events, for instance, or Broadway musicals or television. The total number of screens in this scenario would probably be smaller, though the studio take could be higher. Certainly the profit picture will be complicated, with some studio revenue coming from platform subscriptions, some but not all theaters owned by the studios, and independent theaters scrambling to survive on diverse revenue streams. Maybe it will be that, or maybe it will be something different. But what do you think of my prediction?
I think you pretty much have it right. Yeah, it sounds right to me. Couple thoughts. I do think New York is going to retain a lot of movie theaters for the same reason LA and Hollywood will, because New York will always be the premier destination for the East Coast premiere of whatever new blockbusters coming out. But I do agree that the rest of the country is going to see a drop-off. And I stick to my earlier prediction that movie theaters are going to be kind of niche fare, similar to the vinyl LP for audiophiles.
Yeah.
This has been a slow death. And so the question in my mind is whether the pandemic is going to be the pivotal point where the future movie theaters is finally laid bare, The changes that have been slowly taking place for 8 decades are now going to be accelerated into this new normal you're describing.
Yeah, I definitely think it's an acid test. If the pandemic stretches into much of, if not all of 2021, which is Dr. Fauci's latest prediction, I think in that scenario, then yes, because we saw the studios take virtually all of their blockbuster movies and push them into 2021. I don't think they're going to be willing to do that again. If they can't show them on screens in 2021, then we're going to see them all in streaming.
Yeah.
And that will radically accelerate what we're already seeing, which is a shift from a movie-going culture to one in which we predominantly watch movies at home and then just talk about them with friends and family later on.
Yes. And one of the arguable casualties of that is going to be this shared experience that I was talking about earlier. The whole nation saw Neil Armstrong land on the moon. The whole nation heard Walter Cronkite announce JFK's assassination. And large parts of the nation will see the next Star Wars blockbuster or the next Jaws, right? The only difference is going to be they won't all see it in a movie theater. Some people who want that niche experience will see it in a movie theater, and the rest will sit home on their couch and tune it up on Netflix or Amazon.
Right. Yeah. Not everyone is going to go to Disneyland or Disney World, but enough people will travel to have that experience that Disney makes $16 billion a year off of it. Yes. And so there are going to be people who will be motivated to have that theater experience. And everyone else is going to watch it the way they want to watch it.
Yeah.
I do think that one interesting impact is what we could get out of this is fewer blockbusters. Because if it turns out that a blockbuster cannot make its money back if it goes straight to streaming, then Hollywood could revert to the smaller, the more intimate, the romantic comedies, the dramas. We could see a resurgence of storytelling if the bonus of the huge worldwide blockbuster is no longer as big as it used to be.
Mm.
But that's something that is entirely speculative. I don't know how it would play out.
Well, that was very, very interesting, Mark. Thanks for your explanation.
Yeah. I do try to regulate the amount of time that I put into this podcast, but these last 2 weeks I was just completely out of control because I just found it really interesting and I wanted to go in and get more info and find more about that and then what about this, and it just really sucked me in.
Right. Yeah. So, moving along, do you have a question for me for next time?
Okay, yes, I do have a question for you. And this is one that's actually personally rooted for me. I don't know if I've mentioned it to you before, but my wife, Sonia, her family is Colombian. And something that I always took for granted reading the news media before I met Sonia is that there's something called the Hispanic or the Latino vote. And it's something that you go to Miami to pursue, or maybe you're giving speeches in Arizona or Texas because you want the Hispanic vote. And recently in the election, we saw that maybe that's not a unitary thing, that there might be elements of the Hispanic or Latino community that are headed in different political directions. So my question to you, Joe, to what extent is there a Hispanic vote, and who is it likely to benefit in 2024?
Okay. I will explore that monolith, and I'm sure it will be a lot more complicated than it sounds in the press these days. So, yes, I will get on that.
Okay, I look forward to it.
And that's it for this edition of Mansplaining. That was Mark. I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye, everybody. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.